introduce Daria Krivonos, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki, and she will be talking to you about Ukrainian migration, racial capitalism, and labor.
Yes, thank you, Mikko. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It's really nice to present and discuss my work, and it's really a privilege that you also read my article. Hopefully, even if you didn't read it, we can still discuss many things today. So I prepared a 45 minutes talk, and then after that I was thinking that we can have a discussion and you can ask your questions about the article, about the talk, or we can talk about other things. And also in the middle of my talk I'll have one activation question, so please be alert, stay alert. And, before I move on to the actual talk, I would also like to say a couple of words about the ethical and the emotional regime from which I'm speaking today, and from which I've been doing research for the last 7 months already. I started doing research on Ukrainian migration in 2020. Feels like a different timeline. It was the time before COVID and the time before the full-scale invasion. And then I came back to Warsaw this summer after the invasion had started. And just to say that I always find it very uneasy to talk about my research in this particular context, because I always feel like there is some degree of violence of representing and theorizing people's stories. So I just wanted to share this kind of unease with you. And I know that other colleagues of mine who have been doing research in other contexts of displacement and other contexts of imperialism, they have already answered these ethical questions for themselves. But now I'm also trying to answer my own question, like what is the point of the work I'm doing? I think that one of the, I've been for a long time also, I've been interested in questions of racialization, race, in migration. And within this particular context, the context of Ukrainian displacement, I also started thinking more about how we can build coalitional anti-racist politics with differently racialized migrant groups. But I think it will become more clear to you during my lecture. So, and what I want to do in this talk, kind of the takeaway message is that I would like to remind you, like, also from the perspective of the research that I've been doing like earlier, because I started this research already in 2020, and at that time people were asking like, oh, why are you going to Poland? Why are you interested in Ukraine and in Ukrainian migration? Somehow eastern borders of the European Union have been really overlooked, and very few people were ever interested like internationally. Of course, there is a really great research being done in Poland, kind of from this state Polish perspective. But internationally, if you look at it, there are not so many research articles written on the eastern borders of the EU. But kind of taking into account this longer term perspective, I want to say that Ukrainian migrants have been long present in Europe by doing and sustaining European economies through their invisibilized labor, which I would argue has been largely unrecognized and undervalued, just like other forms of racialized and gendered migrant labor. And the second thing is that, and here I draw on the work of my colleagues, that contrary to the representation of refugees as passive recipients of humanitarian assistance, European markets and European labor markets have always benefited from the racialized and transnational division of labor. Okay, that's kind of maybe the main message I want to give today. I would also like to start with discussing with you some of the media representations of the war in Ukraine and Ukrainian refugee migration that partly became the impulse for this talk. And I'm sure, I mean, that's already kind of a pretty old, that's not news anymore. I'm sure like you already are very familiar how one news agency foreign correspondent told the viewers while reporting from Kiev right in the beginning of the war that Ukraine isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose these words carefully too, city, one where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. And I think it's also, I guess, pretty clear to you how and why this commentary led to a swift backlash online when quite expectedly and quite justifiably, like this form of news reporting was framed as racist, and how kind of explicit references to civilization normalized the war and violence in places which European racist discourse constructs as uncivilized. And have you seen this? Right, okay. And then I have just another example, so it's kind of how another correspondent talks about that. It's very emotional because these are people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. And all these commentaries, as you know, were followed by the extensive and very important critique that pointed to the Orientalist and racist coverage of the news and the racialized mobilization of empathy in response to different people flowing wars. But what I want to do in this talk is also kind of problematize two things. Is that first of all, also this critique, the response to this kind of racist representation, may reproduce the idea that all Ukrainians are white. And second is that by saying that white Ukrainians are white, it can reproduce the idea that white majority of Ukrainians have always been white. And this, I think, what I also discussed in the article, I kind of trace racialization of Ukrainian migrants before the invasion and during the invasion. Okay, and here I would like to share with you some observations from from my fieldwork, which I did this summer in Warsaw railway station. So I was volunteering together with other people who were mostly Ukrainians, by the way. Many of them were displaced Ukrainians themselves. So you're just like standing there at the info point and kind of giving people information. And then, so this is what I wrote in my field diary during the first day of my volunteering, that four Roma women told us that they were kicked out from the refugee center. One of them started crying. She took her Ukrainian passport and showed it to me, saying, "Look, I'm Ukrainian, I have a Ukrainian passport. Where does it say that I'm Roma? I'm Ukrainian, just like everyone else." And then a white Ukrainian woman gave her a phone charger. "It's so good to have good people around." After hearing the story told by a Roma woman, another third woman said, "How can they kick people out? What kind of discrimination is that?" So this is just like one of the examples of kind of how this racialized bordering is taking place also after people, kind of supposedly reach at least relative safety, and kind of how actually not all Ukrainians are recognized as white and not all Ukrainians share solidarity. But also, there were many other episodes where there was racism against Ukrainian Roma, and for example, I heard that tell them that Roma women with kids are not allowed in the mother and the child room. So, and I think that you also probably saw that these were a lot of students from Africa were having difficulty leaving Ukraine, and that attracted like some attention in the media. but also we should think about like what happens and like who is a Ukrainian refugee, like how do we imagine this person, and how people might also share or receive different forms of solidarity when they already arrive, for example, to Poland. So that's one example of kind of which I think we should problematize also the figure of who is a Ukrainian refugee and kind of how this racialized bordering of Ukrainianness are being constructed here. And then I have another example here by coming from Marina, who has Asian descent because her mother came as a migrant worker to Ukraine to work as a seamstress. And it also kind of reminds us about the socialist histories, like common socialist histories between former socialist states in South East Asia and Ukraine, for example. And that's what she says. And I also was volunteering together with her, and I could see that people were very surprised that she spoke Ukrainian and Russian. And she says that sometimes it's even funny to call myself Ukrainian. People always ask me where I learned to speak Russian and Ukrainian so well. And there were also racist jokes which were kind of questioning your Ukrainianness, but also this kind of innocent, supposedly innocent surprises, which led to this question where she learned to speak Russian and Ukrainian. Okay. Are you with me still? Okay. So this is just an example, like two examples from my fieldwork of how kind of these boundaries of Ukrainianness are being constructed and who is seen as a Ukrainian refugee. I think it's also kind of important to rethink our imaginaries. But then at the same time, the other thing that is taking place now is that Poland, with the endorsement of the European Commission, has constructed a really expensive border wall at the Polish-Belarusian border. Have you heard also about the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border? Yes, and you also know probably that their volunteering was criminalized. So kind of helping people trying to get to Poland from the African countries or the Middle East was also criminalized. So you couldn't do that. And for a long time, journalists and activists were not even allowed to enter this border zone between Poland and Belarus. Yeah, but I think that now they're allowed. Finally. Yeah. So it's true that well, for a long time, from the beginning of the situation till the summer, when people were like, well, journalists and some activists could get access to this area. So what I was thinking is that then how can we address multiple forms of racialization as co-constitutive without slipping into competing positions? But also I would like to remind you that how also Finnish media was framing the situation at the border. It was framed as the hybrid threat, as the hybrid warfare, and it also took less than a week to start a discussion on the revision of Finnish legislation and the potential closure of borders to deal with the hybrid threats. And it also, there was a discussion about breaching international agreements regarding human protection. But also just to remind you that, as other scholars of migration have noted, that since the Mediterranean border crisis, the EU has invested a huge amount of resources into securing, closing down the Mediterranean sea routes, and that's why the fact that there are people finding new routes to get to Europe shouldn't come as a surprise. I think, and this is kind of my central question. I've been thinking about that because quite often when I bring the fact that Also in Finland now, for a really long time, people are not able to get residence permits, like for 7 years, for example, people waiting for the asylum decisions. Kind of people tend to think that I want to take something from solidarity with Ukraine, but it's not really true. What I'm interested in into how can we avoid this kind of competing positions and think about different forms of racialization as happening at the same time and as co-constitutive. And how can we think about building anti-racist like kind of coalitions with differently racialized migrant groups. And if you want to follow the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border, as you said, like nobody kind of is interested about in that anymore, but I also invite you to follow Grupa Granica, which has been really active in kind of letting people know about what's happening there. And they have a Twitter account, which is mainly in Polish, but you can still follow and Google Translate that. But what I want to do in this talk and also in my work is that rather than simply comparing the unequal treatment of refugees in Europe, I want to think about how also the construction of Ukrainian refugees as white became possible only recently, and how whiteness, European whiteness itself throughout history, has been fluid, contextual, and historically specific. And while keeping a focus on Ukrainian refugee migration, I want to open a conversation about the role of race and whiteness in European politics of migration more broadly, and how racial categories are constructed in relation to each other. And I think that what the dominant narrative about Ukrainian whiteness, kind of saying that people got temporary protection because they're white and that they have more solidarity because they're white, I think that this narrative also leaves undiscussed the construction of Ukrainian whiteness in relation to hegemonic European whiteness. And what I want to suggest in this talk is that while Ukrainian whiteness becomes valorized in relation to other non-white refugees, Ukrainian whiteness itself hasn't been recognized as full European whiteness either, at least until recently. And that's why I think it's very important to bring this longer-term perspective and look into the role that cheapened and largely invisibilized Ukrainian labor has long played in sustaining West European economies. Other migration researchers writing in their book Against Borders also kind of write about the connections between differently racialized migrant groups. And they write that the majority of detainees held over recent years in British immigration removal centers are black and brown. Many of them are nationals of the UK's former colonies, and yet the top 3 nationalities deported from the UK have been Romanian, Albanian, and Polish since 2016. And then they also continue that differently racialized migrants should not be seen as competitors for meager privileges, but as people whose shared violation might be the ground for coalitional, radical, and anti-racist politics. Yeah, would you like to comment on that? Does it resonate with you? Yeah, so there is this idea of like deserving refugee and undeserving, like kind of bogus asylum seekers. But also, if we look closely into EU migration regime, there are practically no infrastructure for claiming asylum in the EU anymore, and the whole kind of institution of asylum that almost doesn't exist in Europe anymore, because even though there are people who flee conflicts, wars and destruction, climate change, it's so difficult. It's almost impossible nowadays to get a refugee status. So the whole institution of asylum in the EU nowadays is almost, non-existent. And not to say that it was wonderful before, because like the whole idea of asylum, that you have to prove as an individual that you're really in danger, and kind of whole this idea of deservingness, like deservingness of protection is there, which we can also question. But also if we look into temporary protection, which Ukrainian, under which now Ukrainians are protected, you can also see that also these people are not recognized as refugees under the Geneva Convention. And actually what they get is only access to residence permit, access to labor, immediate labor, and also some kind of limited access to welfare resources. So it's also important to remember, even though when people get some sort of protection, which is indeed so much better, and people are much more in a privileged position compared to others. But if we look into what they actually get, is again, it's temporary protection, it's only access to labor, and very little, almost non-existent welfare protection. Yeah. And that's completely you're correct, I think. Because also the whole asylum procedure takes like years and years, and there are still people in Finland who have been waiting for the decisions on the asylum process, like for 6 years, for example. And the outcome of the decision is always questionable. So there is no guarantee that you will actually get asylum in the end. So of course, it's it's no surprise that people just get like this immediate protection and immediate access to the labor market. But if you look into think about the whole architecture of protection in the EU, it's really, really problematic. Okay, but coming back, thank you for interacting with me. But also what I wanted also to bring in this talk is the tension between this whiteness of Ukrainian refugees vis-a-vis other non-white refugees, and also at the same time how this Ukrainian whiteness has been excluded from hegemonic European whiteness. So we should keep this triangle here, and this is also what I had in mind when writing my article. But I don't know also how much you are familiar with the discussion of race in Europe. Have you ever discussed race previously in your studies? Okay, very good. Because quite often when you talk about race, even among some academics, there might be some misunderstandings that people think that if you want to talk about race, that you are bringing racism into the discussion, or you are being racist. So that's why I would like to clarify the terms which I use in this talk. And of course, when I talk about race, I don't mean any this mode of categorizing populations according to the biological criteria of this pseudo-scientific racial science of the 18th and 19th century. But here we can use Alena Lentin's definition, and she's a scholar of race, and she defines it as a technology of management of human difference, the main goal of which is the production, reproduction, and maintenance of white supremacy on both a local and planetary scale. And then she continues and gives this example that we can see the workings of racial logic in the false idea that there are enclaves or ghettos or self-segregating migrant communities that disrupt social cohesion. So quite often we can see in the media discussions that that there is some kind of social cohesion. It's kind of walled by whiteness. Kind of this cohesion is already given, and then it becomes disrupted by the arrival of migrants, who are usually imagined, of course, as non-white. And also then Stuart Hall, have you heard about the cultural theorist Stuart Hall? Very good. And there he also writes in his work that race is the centerpiece of a hierarchical system that produces difference. So here this idea of the production of difference is very important. So there's no any given, no given biological difference, but difference is always produced, right, through different social technologies. And also race is not obviously only about skin color, and we're going to talk about it later, but it's also about the delineation and the bordering of Europeanness from non-Europeanness. Okay, do you have any questions about race here? It's very good that you already heard about this before. You're more advanced than many migration scholars. So, yeah, and kind of always returning to what I want to say in this talk is that how the construction of Ukrainian refugees as white or whiter became possible only recently and might be temporary. And here I want to come back to another theorist and philosopher and psychiatrist, one of the major theorists of racialization, who also was writing his own work in the context of Algerian war for independence. So also anti-colonial struggle is very central to his work. So I'm sure you also heard about Frantz Fanon if you know about race. But kind of what is so important in his work on racialization, kind of how he theorizes racialization as a relational process. And he reminds us that racialization as a process that constructs and stabilizes difference is always relational, meaning that there is no whiteness without blackness and there is no blackness without whiteness. He writes that ontology doesn't permit us to understand the being of the black man. For not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. So, and this idea of relationality is very important also to my work and in this presentation, that, as I mentioned, that Ukrainian whiteness can be also constructed both in relation to non-whiteness and in relation to hegemonic European whiteness. But also I think here we can think about Afro-pessimism and the idea that there is always a need to have this black figure through which kind of this whiteness and deservingness of some refugees can emerge. And this is also this theorizing in Afro-pessimist tradition, that kind of there is always a need to have this black figure which would enable other forms of racial categories and other forms of violence and deserving. Okay, and then and you can say, okay, this is all nice or important, Frantz Fanon, Stuart Hall, but then the question is, how do we fit Central and Eastern Europe in this discussion, right? Because quite often there is a tendency to discuss colonialism and race in this kind of binaries, kind of colonized versus colonizers, north versus south, and white and black binary. But then kind of, okay, where do we put Central and Eastern Europe here? Because if we think about, if race is not only about blackness, but it's also about whiteness, and kind of the whole idea is that everybody is racialized, and as everybody is gendered and is sexualized too, right? So how can we theorize racialization in the context of Central and Eastern Europe? And I've been researching particularly racialization of migrants from the east of Europe. And here I found Anca Parvulescu's work quite important and inspiring, and also refer to her in my article. And she uses this term of racial triangulation, and then she brings it in the context of Europe. And using this European racial triangulation, she brings like both semi-peripheries of Europe, like Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and Europe's former colonies into dialogue. And so she kind of keeps this triangle and the tension between the three figures, between white Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and Black Europeans, and kind of how she looks, how these positions and these figures are being racialized kind of in relation to each other. So I really recommend you to read Parvulescu's work. It's open. There's like that article is in open access. So, and I think it's quite inspiring, and it's kind of one of the ways kind of to push the conversation further on race and coloniality beyond this kind of black and white binaries, and also to bring this figure of Central East European migrant. Okay, so how we can bring Europe with external, non-European and internal East European peripheries as one object of analysis. And then in recent years, also in the context of Brexit, especially, and in the context of racism against Central and East European migrants in the UK, many researchers have written about whiteness of East European migrants and kind of how their whiteness also been constructed as subordinate to hegemonic whiteness. And there are different metaphors which researchers use. So like they use peripheral whiteness, frustrated whiteness, subordinated whiteness. Kind of, and the idea is to capture that white pigmentation alone is not enough to be to get like access to white privilege, like to hegemonic white privilege. Yeah. Do you have any questions about that? Yes, it's all clear. Yeah, and kind of just also to add a couple of ideas here is that how also this discourse of racialization in relation to East European migrants works is that we see kind of how migrants from the east of Europe are racialized or kind of as essentialized as having these particular qualities and particular skills which allow them to endure heavy physical labor. That is only Polish workers in the UK that can do this heavy physical labor. Kind of, and we can see this essentialization that how people are naturally having these natural capacities to endure physical labor. And also when I was volunteering at the station, and there were a lot of people from Canada who were coming there also and to help people. But there also many people were talking about how kind of we have to help all these hard-working Ukrainians, kind of, and they used also this word like Soviet, like post-Soviet people find jobs in Canada. And of course, if you ask like what kind of jobs would be available for them, and when I asked, they said like, oh, I know one employer who needs like 50 car mechanics. And the idea is that it doesn't matter what skills people are bringing, but what is the demand for labor here. And then it's very different from the discourse of 2015 when refugees were framed as stealing our jobs. And already here you can see like a difference of how different groups of migrants are being racialized in very different ways. Ones are those who steal the jobs, and mainly these are male migrants kind of who steal the jobs, because also a lot of reproductive labor and care labor is totally outsourced to female migrant and racialized workers. And at the same time, kind of this framing of Ukrainian displaced people as kind of a very good fit for agricultural work or other forms of labor. So we see kind of how we can use this racialization here. Okay, now comes the activation moment. I don't know if you want to do that, but I just wanted to maybe to give you an opportunity to discuss and reflect on what I told you, Now, so how do you think and how do you see Ukrainian displacement being narrated in the Finnish media now? And do you think race is a useful category to understand migration in Europe today? So 5 minutes, you can discuss with your neighbor, with the group. Yeah, I'm not going to ask now, but let's just keep your thoughts and make notes, and we will get back to them during the discussion. But now I would just like to move to a more ethnographic part of my talk. Even though I have a graph here, there will be only 2 graphs in this presentation. So in February 2020, I arrived to Warsaw to do research on Ukrainian migration to Poland, and what interested me at the time was that Poland was a major host of labor migrants in the EU, and Ukrainian migrant workers and Ukrainian citizens are the main group who receives work-related residence permits in the EU. So around almost like 500,000 residence permits based on work have been given to Ukrainian citizens in the last several years. And also Poland is an interesting case because it combines extensive out-migration, and there is a lot of research on Polish migrants in the UK, for example, but also because it has an extensive economic growth, there is a significant unfulfilled labor demand, which is mainly coming from Ukraine. And here I have a graph, it's very small, but it says that top 10 countries whose citizens received the first residence permit by country of citizenship in the years 2019 and 2021. And it's Ukraine, you see how extensive it is, followed by Morocco, Belarus, India, Russia, Brazil, Turkey. Yeah. And then also if we look into Finland, it's also interesting because we rarely talk about that. But this is the statistics from Migri website, that these are decisions of work-related residence permits from 2015 to 2022, all together. And it's Ukraine again is #1, followed by Russian Federation, India, and Philippines. And that's kind of what interested me at the time, and this is the picture of from Warsaw bus station, where a lot of labor migrants, but also now refugees are coming and going and arriving in this Warszawa Zachodnia station. And when I started doing interviews, and I mainly got access to Ukrainian students in 2020, they were all telling me a very similar story, that they were basically recruited by Polish universities to come to Poland to get a bachelor degree. So there is this vast network of transnational recruitment agencies, which also get money from the Polish government for each recruited student that they get coming to Poland. And here I have one research participant saying that a recruiter from a Polish university told me about opportunities to get higher education abroad, mainly in Poland and the Czech Republic. It was a private university, so it was very easy to get in. We had 80 people in our group, and only 7 of them were Poles. Everyone was from Ukraine and Belarus, a couple of people from Russia and Kazakhstan. So it's also kind of how these private Polish universities are making money by recruiting Ukrainian students, because actually getting a degree in Poland might be even cheaper than getting a degree in Ukraine. And many young people already started learning Polish language in high school, and they were really preparing, and they were all telling me the same story. So when you talk about saturation, I don't know if you discussed it in your qualitative methods. At some point you start hearing the same story, and the saturation point for me was achieved really early on, because people were just telling the same story over and over again. And of course it comes from the like large demand for labor, because many students become student workers. And then here I have also very interesting interview. It's quite small letters, but I'll read it to you. So here, and this interview I did it already this summer. And again, Andriy was telling me about how he came to Poland first as an exchange student. And also, kind of we can compare like what is a typical exchange student story which we imagine and what is his exchange student story. And actually he was telling me this like very romantic picture about like going to study in Poland in this town, like small town in the north of Poland, and kind of also many Ukrainian young people were narrating it as the West, like how Poland is the West, you can get European education there. So it was like constructing this like very fascinating picture of coming to Poland and Poland itself. So he says, I went to the city in the north of Poland as an exchange student, and unlike Ukrainian labor migrants who, and then he used this kind of censor word, like who work very hard, I knew I would be a student. I would study and party, so he like distanced himself from this like labor migrant figure, but he's not going to work hard. I really liked the place, it matched all my expectations about Poland. And then just later he says that there I got my first job in Poland, which didn't really differ much from all the other jobs that Ukrainian labor migrants do in Poland. It was a small city, but every square meter of the city has a factory. They have 7 plants and factories. I worked in a plastic factory, called it kurwer, from Polish kurwa, which means like fuck or something like that. As the conditions of work matched the name. 8 hours of monotonous work. It was an exchange program with our home university in Ukraine, but the exchange was one way. All Ukrainians were coming to Poland. Why would a Polish student come to our provincial university in Ukraine? Never heard of anyone coming to visit our university from Poland. And then he continues, we got this offer to work in a factory. There was a candy factory, a plastic factory, and a fish factory. Many girls went to work in a candy factory, but after 1 week they switched to a plastic factory because all their skin was covered in sugar. 8 hours of moving candies in boxes, and he just showed like what you do like all day long, just standing there. And these were mostly Ukrainian exchange students who worked in this factory. And then I asked him, like, but how did you combine your studies with work, and did you come there actually to study? And then he says, luckily everything was so close in this town. You leave your night shift, you come home, take a shower, and go to the university to sleep. When the teacher saw you sleeping, he would ask other students, was he working? People would say, yes, he was, and then the teacher would not disturb him. So everybody was also understanding, and everybody knew that there were many workers, students from Ukraine working in this factory. And then he says, so 80 of us were working, 80% of all the students who came and lived in the dormitory worked in the factory, and the other 20 were Belarusians who were paid a bursary for studying in Poland. Okay, but how would you analyze and how do you see this narrative? What scares you? Yeah, but also I want to say that when I talked to Andriy, he was like, as I already said, that he was showing like kind of constructing this very romantic picture of that town. And he said, oh, now I came back there and I was taking pictures everywhere. And yeah, it was such a hard time, but I made friends there and I was young. And actually he managed to save a lot of money, with which he then later paid, well, not all his studies, but I think like part of his studies in Warsaw, because then he moved to Warsaw to get a master's degree. Yeah, so I think that what we can also learn here is that quite often when we talk about like labor migration and labor migrants, like who are labor migrants and how students are never really included in this like statistics of labor migrants. But also in Finland, there is research done in Finland, for example, by Olivia Mauri, who also looks into how non-EU students are working in the service sector, and how like platform labor totally runs like on so many non-EU students who also need jobs to renew their residence permits, because to get the residence permit you need to show that you have income in Finland, or you have amount of money on your bank account. So yeah, we can maybe discuss this later. So, and then we can come back to the question of race, because you would ask me, okay, where is race here? So here we can see how there is this kind of active recruitment of Ukrainian students and student workers and workers. Also during COVID, I did interviews via Skype with Ukrainian agricultural workers, and they told me that like in a city of 100,000 people, there were something like 8 agencies that were sending workers to Finland to do agricultural work, only to Finland. So there is this kind of a recruitment of Ukrainian labor, but at the same time, we can see kind of how in Poland, for example, there was this refusal to accept quota refugees, and then there is this term like Islamophobia without Muslims, that even though Polish is often described as like a super homogeneous society, and foreign population is like very small, like there, I can't now remember the percentage, but like, I don't know, maybe 3% or something like that. Kind of still like this imagined threat is kind of coming from a Muslim figure. But and again, that what it reminds us that it's never only about numbers themselves. That's why this kind of term of Islamophobia without Muslims. So you don't need to have actually people living in the country to have racism. But also kind of how the process of EU accession and the EU expansion to the east, or like EU accession, was conditional upon like making Poland and other Central East European countries as this kind of external borders of the EU, and they kind of became responsible for keeping all migrants out. So it was also like kind of as a condition to joining the EU, how Polish eastern frontiers became a barrier protecting the EU. And quite similar things are now happening in the Balkans when these agreements with the EU are being made, like with Montenegro and with Serbia, that these countries now have to keep migrants out if they want in the future to join the EU, and if they themselves want to join this kind of free circulation within the EU. Okay, actually I almost ran out. I mean, I was supposed to speak for 45 minutes, but now it's already 50 minutes. But I just want to go quickly like through some of the interviews. So, and then while we think about the costs of student migration, and then one of my research participants, whom I interviewed in 2020, and then I saw her again in 2022, she said that during the second year of my bachelor studies, I couldn't take her mother working so hard any longer to fund her studies in Warsaw. So that's why I found work in a hotel. I know my mom had to work very hard to earn this money so that I would feel myself okay in Warsaw, nothing special, just an okay living in Warsaw. I went to work so my mom could finally breathe. And it's also kind of important to mention like what are the costs of student migration, because well, still people have to pay for their studies in Warsaw and in Poland, and still the cost of living is very high, and that's why many like parents have to like take debt. They like may take like several jobs to fund their students, their children's studies, and kind of how this educational trajectory is also imagined as a migration trajectory, that it's kind of through education you manage to leave Ukraine and then kind of to build future labor market opportunities and kind of also stay there in the future. So it's, in a way, it's also imagined as some kind of an investment in the future. And then again, coming back to kind of the costs, this Marina continues how she was working in the hotel, I wake up at 6, at 8, I'm at the university taking an exam. After that, I go to work in a hotel and work there till 10 in the evening. Or sometimes I will work from 2 p.m. or 4 p.m. till 2 a.m. And I used to take a taxi to get home, as I was afraid I would fall asleep on the bus and it would bring me to the end of the line. So she'll just fall asleep and oversleep her stop. Yeah, and also like here I was thinking about kind of how it was so very difficult to stay in touch with this person because of her really irregular working hours. So quite often we are, I don't know, encouraged to keep in touch with our research participants, but also then there is this ethical question when the person is working like around the clock all the time and like taking exams and studying, and then you're coming with your annoying interview and saying, so that I could show you this interview here. Well, yeah, I think, well, this is also something I've been thinking about, like how our research participants can benefit from the time that they are giving us. And then another person was also saying that I'm really used to living away from my family. My mom lived and worked in Italy. My dad left our village for work in Kiev and then in Moscow. Well, it was like also before 2014. And he worked in Poland too. All that to make my studies in Warsaw possible. Well, and kind of what I wanted to show and discuss here is that how on the one hand we have this kind of active recruitment and kind of how Ukrainian students and workers are imagined as kind of culturally similar, integratable, like linguistically assimilatable, you know. But at the same, and you could say that, yeah, this is a form of whiteness. But at the same time, if we look like closely into people's everyday lives, as I showed you, so people don't have the same access to like hegemonic whiteness and to white privilege, but also they're not protected from everyday forms of racism and also from institutional racism. And in the article, I discuss like one situation of this harassment in the university, and then when, well, those who haven't read that how this student was using a laptop in class, and then a teacher told and addressed her specifically and as a Ukrainian student, and then kind of said that kind of some very bad things. And when she wanted to make a complaint, the dean said, we don't need problems here because there are so many Ukrainians, so you'd better not complain. So it was in 2020 and I was doing my field work. Then I came back to Finland because there was COVID. I almost took the last plane because everybody was closing borders in the EU. But if you remember, the only exception, like one of the few exceptions, when the borders were open, they were open for migrant workers coming from Eastern Europe. And also, specifically in the context of Finland, it was the context of Ukrainian migrants. And there was a lot of discussion, like we all suddenly realized that kind of food doesn't come from nowhere, that somebody has to grow the food and plant and pick vegetables. And apparently that cannot be replaced by the machines because it's much cheaper actually to employ people rather than build like expensive machinery and then pay engineers to maintain them. And like now recent research also shows how the switch to Eastern European migrant workers was seen as a quick response to enable labor mobility with less priority on the coordination of social rights. So the idea was that people come here and then kind of, well, actually there is little care about the all kind of COVID, like protection from COVID. And in addition to what we already know that the hourly wage is very low, and in practice it's even lower, there's also high dependence on employers because your visa is dependent on the employer. And so, and if the employer, you have like a bad employer, you can't leave him because you can lose your visa. But also people acquire debt because they travel to Finland on their own money. They also pay for own accommodation, they pay for their own food, and quite often they also pay to agencies. Earlier I talked about these transnational agencies that hire people, and actually you would need to pay. And there are also many fake agencies, and people like ended up paying like 1,500 euros to an agency which turned out to be a fake one. So then people acquire debt and they become like dependent on this kind of form of circulation of labor. Okay, there are some concluding thoughts, and we can discuss them later. That I think that it's important to remember that migration and displacement is not like a purely humanitarian issue, but migrants and refugees have always been included into race labor markets as workers or as non-workers. And also, like in general, the survival of migrants and refugees often falls outside the purview of state welfare. Also, we look at the students who labor in Finland, quite often, well, they don't have access to welfare services. And that's why we really need to talk about questions of labor. And when we talk about integration, okay, what does it really mean to get integrated in Finland? Is it just enough to get any kind of work, or we actually really want to ask what kind of skills people have, and kind of how to properly remunerate their labor and respect their rights and to create proper conditions. But also I was thinking how anti-Black and anti-Muslim refugee politics in Europe should be further considered in the context of the hierarchies of whiteness. So it's not only like the black and white binary that all Ukrainians are white, that's why they gain this protection, but also I think I wanted to show you these examples that there are also this kind of hierarchies of whiteness and the unequal access to membership in whiteness, even among those who enjoy some sort of privilege and kind of proximity to Europeanness and whiteness. And also then how can we understand this continuous reshuffling and hierarchical grading of racialized subjects? What does this production of difference do and who gains from it? And maybe that could be one of the starting questions for our discussion now. Yes, thank you.